Okay. Welcome again. I'm Beverly with Scholar Strike for Liberation.
And I'm
And,
Sarah.
and Sarah. Welcome again, Sarah. Yes, I think we're getting
And
feedback.
I don't hear.
I'm getting feedback. Oh, okay. So I think I know why. I think I know why. Okay. We should be fine now. I think the feedback was coming from somewhere else. My apologies. So Sarah, we just the first panel on state repression and academic
Mm.
freedom just finished, and now
Yeah.
we're going into this session on active refusals. But
Mhm.
before that, I wanted to ask you, what were some of your thoughts on the panel that we just heard?
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm left thinking about academic freedom and what it means to me. And I'm reminded that academic freedom is not just, the right to speak or the right to research or teach without interference. It's the right to think in ways that challenge and contest dominant power, to produce knowledge that challenges empire, to ask questions that institutions would prefer remain unasked and not being considered. And so I think that what we're now seeing both locally and globally is that when academic freedom is exercised in solidarity with, Palestine, with Sudan, with indigenous sovereignty movements, or with any struggle for liberation, institutions then suddenly renew or redraw their boundaries. And so definitely left thinking about the student organizing that I engage with at UFT, as well as,
Hmm.
yeah, what academic freedom means to me as a student who
Hmm.
organizes on this campus.
Right. Thank you for that. What I really appreciated with this panel was, I think they actually did speak to what it means in terms of, refusals, generative refusal in terms of that, and I think I heard each of the panelists in some way speak to this idea that, that refusals could also be on a small level that
Mm,
refusal, doesn't necessarily have to be on a large, big picture level, right?
absolutely.
It can be that which, and we talk about generative stemming as embodiment coming from the body, which is basically what it is. But we're speaking about generative and other forms of refusals as well. And what we got from the first panel is the way in which individuals can figure out ways how to to deal with things like media, for instance,
Mm,
on AI. And I think some suggestions, came from maybe one of the things to resist the way in which social media and, plays in our lives
mm,
and where we become so obsessed and takes up so much space in our life is maybe we could think of unplugging. Maybe
absolutely.
we can think of, and figuring out ways to negotiate those kinds of spaces, in ways that actually doesn't always have to be within the big picture. Because social media, and when we think of, social media, we used to think in the old day, when it came out, I mean, I didn't grow up with social media. That's very new to me. I came from an old generation of where you write, right? Or where you call people. And that was another good thing about this is that, the return to relationality was
Mm,
was another thing that was also stressed.
absolutely.
So that was important, is that the return to relate that, because we have gotten so caught up behind screens and machines, and there's no question that COVID enhanced that, right?
Mm,
Which allows a lot of regulation, right?
mm,
Also, was talked about, which allowed a lot of regulation and policing and criminalization very easily, even on these particular, you know, formal, these particular media platforms. I mean, somebody says something on media and you get reprimanded for it, right? As
absolutely.
an
Yeah.
academic or as a student. Why?
Mhm.
Because they are regulated, they're surveilled. These are platforms that are owned by billionaires and millionaires, right?
Mhm.
whose
Mhm.
agenda is really capitalist, whose agenda is really imperialist, and they're not really platforms that really speak to, even though we get to put certain things on it, or we challenge, the state and the world by using it. They're not really designed for us,
Right.
right? They'll permit particular kinds of
Mhm.
discourses and narratives and conversation, but then they'll lock us out if it becomes the kind of language or kind of a conversation that they and the state and other institutions oppose, right? So,
And the word there that you used, permit, that definitely takes my mind to Sudan now, where we see the Sudanese neighborhood committees not only rejecting, this military dictatorship, but also building new horizontal neighborhood-based structures of governance. And we see this as generative refusal, saying no to authoritarianism while actively then producing democratic forms of collective decision making, of mutual aid, of political education. And the best possible person to speak to this is, of course, Professor Nasreen Elamine. As a student at the University of Toronto, I feel beyond lucky to have faculty like her present. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology and the African Studies program. Her work investigates the connections between land and race and belonging and empire making in Sudan and the broader Sahel region. She uses land and struggles over land as a lens through which to examine state surveillance of Sahelian migration, as well as Gulf Arab corporate investments and political interventions in Sudan and neighboring countries. Thank you so much for joining us. We are beyond grateful, and I can't wait to continue to learn from you today and beyond.
welcome, Nusrin. Thank you so much for joining us. So we'll
Thank
let you go ahead, and then maybe we can have a couple questions. Are you okay with that? I mean, from us,
you.
or
That sounds great. Yeah, and I just wanted to thank you so much for that beautiful and generous introduction. It's always an honor for me to be in conversation with two people I admire a lot, and yeah, whose organizing I've learned a lot from. So thank you. So I wanted to kind of start maybe by just giving a little bit of background, and then I'll go into the work of the resistance committees and the emergency response rooms, just for people who might not know exactly what's happening in Sudan. So you probably know that the war in Sudan has received really little mainstream media attention, despite the fact that
yes,
it's produced the world's largest displacement, humanitarian, and hunger crisis. And when it does get some coverage, it's usually framed as a faraway civil war that has nothing to do with us. And
yes,
I think this is about, a couple of things. It's about the racist assumption that war is somehow a natural way of being for us as Africans. We see images of starving Black bodies on the front of the New York Times with no analysis of the local and external forces like the IMF and the World Bank, Gulf state investors, for example, Canadian mining and weapons manufacturing companies that have co-produced famine in a country that could easily feed itself and the entire region. It's also about the fact that Canadian companies have long been implicated in state violence in Sudan. The Talisman Company and the Swedish Canadian London Oil Company funded the regime of Sudan's former dictator Omar al-Bashir to quote unquote clear oil concession areas, knowing this would lead to forced displacement and massacres of civilians during the bloodiest phase of our civil war against the South. And that also created the financial viability for the genocide in Darfur that began in 2003 that we see kind of revival of now. There's also a Montreal-based PR firm called Dickens and Madsen, headed by an ex-Israeli intelligence officer, which represented the Rapid Support Forces, which is one of the military factions fighting in this war, in the aftermath of a massacre that they committed with other security forces against protesters during the 2018 and 19 revolution, essentially to clean up its image and to deepen its ties with the Russian and Emirati elites who are now providing them with critical support as they commit genocide in North Darfur. We've also just learned that Canadian Sterling Cross defense rifles and Strite armored vehicles are being used by the RSF in Darfur as they commit genocide. And so, yeah, so this near kind of media blackout on Sudan is also, I think, because it's an internationalized counter-revolutionary war that is meant to foreclose any possibility of civilian rule, any possibility of the resistance committees kind of gaining more power, and to protect the financial and political interests of Sudanese elites and their international partners. Sudan had a really powerful revolution in 2018-19 that overthrew the brutal Bashir regime that had waged multiple wars against civilians as it extracted oil and minerals and grabbed fertile lands, and then sold it to foreign and domestic investors. And it was in power for 30 years and then was overthrown by this massive million-person sit-in in front of the military headquarters in Khartoum. I would say that the backbone of this revolution are the 8,000 neighborhood resistance committees, but also working class unions, youth and feminist formations, Farmers Alliance, etc. The resistance committees are, as Sarah mentioned, these non-hierarchical, consensus-based organizing groups coordinated across the country that organize protests against military elites who took over after al-Bashir was ousted and then staged a coup in 2021. But who also organized towards a different Sudan, developing these really radical revolutionary charters that suggest a dismantling of the Sudanese state in its current violent, extractive, and ethno-nationalist formation, kind of capturing power from elites and distributing it at the grassroots level. And so the current war, we really have to understand it as a counter-revolutionary war because the military elites currently fighting each other don't want this vision of a Sudan to become a reality, and neither do their international partners, who know very well that military rule will secure their lucrative extractive capitalism and that the Sudanese revolution could have a domino effect across the region, really, against their own rule and power in the Gulf and elsewhere, right? So again, I want to just make the point that's quite obvious, but that war is never a natural state of being. War is big business for local and international elites, for whom the far away of wars in places like Sudan is a constructed convenience, providing cover for their extractive profit-making and war crimes. There are really no wars in 2025 that most of us living here in the settler colonies of North America are not somehow connected to through our tax dollars, our pension funds, our university endowments, the banks we deposit our money in, the cell phones we use, and so on. I remember when we did research for this to look into divesting our university's pension plan, we discovered from weapons manufacturing companies supplying the Israeli occupation forces, we discovered that a lot of the same companies are also supplying the United Arab Emirates, which supports the RSF in Sudan as it commits genocide in Darfur, and the Rwandan Defense Forces implicated in the war and the 29-year plunder of the Congo. And so, as we can see, the network of corporate murders are connected across borders and states, which means really that our organizing against them needs to be as well. In North Darfur right now, the UAE is extracting Sudanese gold in exchange for weapons to the Rapid Support Forces. Last year, 90% of Sudan's official gold exports flowed to the UAE, which reported $53.4 billion in gold export revenues. And these are just the official numbers. So I could talk to you about the statistics that this war has produced, the 14 million Sudanese who've been displaced, many multiple times from resource-rich lands that are being used to fuel this war, the 19 million children who are out of school, the 13 million who are at the brink of starvation, the estimated 150 to 500,000 people killed. In this month, after 18 months of siege, the Rapid Support Forces are committing genocide as they take full control of Al-Fashir in North Darfur, while 99,000 civilians have managed to flee Al-Fashir in recent days. Over 150 million civilians still remain trapped inside the city with no access to food or healthcare as the RSF commits massacres in a targeted ethnic cleansing campaign against non-Arab indigenous communities, again with weapons produced in Canada. But I think part of the issue is that statistics have been part of the problem, in that Black life is often reduced to statistics to naturalize, depoliticize, and erase man-made crises that provide cover for resource extraction. So I'll just end by talking a little bit about the generative refusal and organizing that people are engaging in right now. Within hours of the war breaking out, I was still in Sudan at the time, I witnessed people in our neighborhood mobilize evacuations and chart safe exit routes for people, activate medicine and bread drives for people with limited mobility and resources. People were literally dodging bullets, trying to bring elders who couldn't leave their homes buckets of water from the Nile. For people who were able to successfully flee their cities, rural people opened their homes and fed them as they continued observing Ramadan. Soon, emergency response rooms emerged out of the existing network of resistance committees led by thousands of volunteers. There's about 700 of them right now across the country. In the face of a barely present international aid community, which I should say, the resistance committees in the beginning of the war were the only people who knew how to evacuate the diplomats and the international aid agencies who then abandoned Sudan. So that's also, and many of the diplomats kept like some of the passports of the people that had been applying for visas and didn't take them out. So then people got trapped as well. So just to see kind of that organized abandonment. Yeah. So in the face of a barely present international aid community and absent functioning state, these young people are leading food and medicine distribution efforts, organizing communal kitchens, driving ambulances, coordinating evacuations, setting up ad hoc emergency clinics and rape crisis centers, repairing and restoring water and electricity services, and retrieving and burying dead bodies. A farmers' alliance in the agricultural heartland of Sudan recently launched a We Must Plant campaign. This was actually last year, through which they've distributed vegetable seeds to 2,400 families. Just weeks after the RSF committed massacres on the land, people began to grow food for nourishment and recovery on it. Beyond allowing people to feed themselves, the alliance is essentially allowing Sudanese farmers to remain on or return to their land at a time when the risk of land grabs is very high, particularly once the guns are silenced. So if you'd like to support any of these groups, you can go to the Sudan Solidarity Collective's website. We've been raising money for them at sudansolidarity.com. So the last point I'm going to make is that Sudanese people who are trying to survive the catastrophe of this war are continuing the revolution. They're continuing to organize for people's basic needs. They're running the entire country in the absence of a functional state. Their radical mutual aid efforts represent a counterpoint to militarized violence. The response rooms, as I mentioned, grew out of the resistance committees, and they're refusing militarization, resisting war, building towards a food sovereign future. These are the same people who were protesting military rule before the war broke out. To stand in solidarity with their refusal, you can support calls to impose an arms and trades embargo on the UAE until it stops arming the RSF. The UAE is one of Canada's biggest trading partners. Canada imports gold from the UAE, which is most likely from Sudan, and it exports weapons, as I mentioned, as the RSF to the UAE, which then ends up in Sudan. And so I think one of our refusals, and I'll just end with the sentence, is to refuse the lie that Canada is not willfully complicit in the war and genocide in Sudan. Thank you very much.
Thank you. This was really, really so helpful. I mean, I like and so important and so significant because you're right. We don't, there's very little conversation on Sudan. I mean, the media definitely doesn't cover it. I don't even think I don't see it in the alternative media, if there's such a thing anymore. There used to be one time, but when we have alternative radio stations at universities or in the community, but I'm not even seeing any information on Sudan. And I am glad that you are present here in the diaspora to help make those connections for us, because maybe we would not have been hearing about it or not knowing exactly what is happening on the ground. So this is very helpful to know what is happening on the ground. And I'm thankful for thank you for your list of refusals that's happening, and the kind of generative work, which is collective, that you're hearing that's happening, in Sudan, but also here in Canada. And I guess in other parts of the diaspora, wherever that work is happening. So we're very grateful. And thank you for telling us and letting us know how we can continue to support, the struggle of the Sudanese people in this very moment, who's actually fighting and defending their lives, right? And defending the onslaught from big corporations and, of course, nation states like the US and the UAE and other factions. So, Nazreen, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll keep connecting because we need to keep this work and to spread this and to make the situation, what's happening in Sudan, much broader in terms of how we build a movement to support the Sudanese people.
And also just acknowledging really quickly the double burden that both yourself and other members of the Sudan Solidarity Collective are engaged in, witnessing this genocide back home and your people being massacred, while then also continuously showing up within organizing and movement spaces to garner funds and to support, for example, these neighborhood committees and resistance committees that are offering alternate ways of living and being. And I like that you mentioned Gaza and how you emphasized that across both struggles, the Sudanese struggle and the Palestinian struggle, we see mutual aid as a political project. Mutual aid is not charity, right? It's how the people collectively declare that life will continue and declare that, the community will be protected and that new worlds can be built even in the face of genocide. And so these are the refusals that we must think about that generate survival and solidarity and new political possibilities. And again, I'm just in awe of you and the work that the Sudan Solidarity Collective, I don't know how you have gathered the strength to do this work that you folks have been doing, but just so beyond grateful to have you here and to share some of what you have today. And so thank you for joining once again.
Thank you for having me. But I also want to say that it is because of all of you, including Omar, who I just saw came on. Solidarity,
yes.
that we're able to, as a collective, to sustain this work. I mean, it's been really critical, I think, to build coalition and sort of, just to be in the struggle together and to make those connections. We otherwise wouldn't have been able to do the work we do. So I'm very, very grateful to all of you. Thank you.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much for joining.
Bye-bye.
And with that, yes, thank you for naming that Omid is now in the room. Omid is another person that I respect so much. He is the son of Palestinian refugees of Lebanon and an organizer with the Palestinian Youth Movement. And he currently studies political science at York University. Omar, thank you so much for joining and for taking the time to share with us how you and other folks at the Palestinian Youth Movement engage with generative refusals within your own organizing.
Absolutely.
Hi, Omar. Nice to
Hello.
meet you. I'm Beverly.
Nice to meet you, Beverly. Thanks for having us. Thanks for inviting us to speak. I think it's a very critical moment right now. I think, especially in the topic of refusal of narratives, couple developments over the last few days. And I think just to maybe zoom out into the historical lens, I think the dominant Western narrative around Palestine has always been whether we have the right to a state, whether we have a right to self-determination, let alone existence in a general sense. And what we're seeing right now is that this narrative is being revived again. It's brought to the front and center, specifically in Western institutional spaces. And given, if people have been following the United Nations Security Council update yesterday, where the resolution pushed by the US and Israel was passed, what we're seeing is that Palestinian sovereignty in itself is in a critical moment. It's under attack, despite motions to recognize statehood, despite our flags being raised, which we spoke at yesterday, which is a positive development. But we have to situate it in the context that our people in Gaza are still being bombed, they're still being killed by hunger. Our people in the West Bank are still subjected to military incursions. Political prisoners are only growing despite the prisoner exchanges, and the torture in the prisons has only escalated. The horrific accounts of sexual abuse, of hunger, of physical violence. And then yesterday, what we have at the United Nations is a resolution passing that's going to essentially recreate the British mandate of Palestine on American terms. You're going to have a quote unquote international stabilization force. You're going to have what's called a board of peace, which is essentially Arab bourgeois Western diplomats dictating the sovereignty status of Palestinians. And history shows us that this is never actually pointing to true sovereignty or liberation for Palestinians. And if we remember a couple months ago when Canada, France, and European states were pushing, or actually pushed over the line, the recognition of a Palestinian state, it was only tethered to very specific conditions. So this was the disarmament of all resistance factions. It required foreign oversight as we saw yesterday in the UN resolution. Every condition is tied to security guarantees for Israel and also the rehabilitation of the Palestinian Authority as a governing partner. So none of these conditions are actually bringing material benefit to Palestinians or the status of our liberation. And just to emphasize too, like Tony Blair is being assigned as the leader of this board of peace. This is a war criminal who butchered our siblings in Iraq, and we refuse that this is the leader or the diplomat that's going to dictate our sovereignty. So where our refusal comes in, and specifically as the Palestinian youth movement, the intervention that we're trying to make is grassroots organizing, specifically the Arab diaspora youth. We know, and it's shown that this is the critical side of political struggle, specifically in the terrain that we exist. Because for us, we're a diaspora that we exist in the belly of the beast. We exist in the webs of imperialism and the gears of its economy. And in the Canadian context, if anyone's been following our Arms Embargo Now campaign, Canadian-made armed components are being used to kill our families in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Lebanon, in the region. So like I said yesterday, I spoke at Toronto City Hall to commemorate the raising of the flag. But meanwhile, 15 kilometers away from that site, there are springs and F-35 components being made used to kill our people. So this is the struggle that we exist in right now. It's ideological and it's material as well. And for us, it's grassroots power that's actually going to bring material benefit to our people. We were talking about mutual aid prior. This is one of the many fronts that we have to take on to help Gaza rebuild on its own terms, not on Western terms, not on the NGO terms. And then material on top of that is an arms embargo. And I know, there was a recent CBC report that also outlined that Canadian weapons are being used to kill Sudani people as well. So to link our struggles, that this is a global struggle and we're all suffering from the same system. And we all exist within the system. Unfortunately, where we work, where we pay taxes, how we live is contributing to it. And for us, the goal is, how do we reorient ourselves to be aware of this, disgusting, violent system, and be agents of change? How can we, as members of this society, enforce material change for our people back home? Because we're not removed from our national liberation struggle. We are part and parcel of it. I'm a third-generation refugee. I have a role just as someone on the ground does have the role to confront this occupation. And then specifically for Canada, because we should focus a bit on Canada. It likes to portray itself as a peaceful, peacemaking nation. And this has never been true. It's the furthest thing from the truth from its inception to how it operates in international politics. It claimed twice that it's implemented a freeze on arms exports to Israel. While it's like partially true, what they're doing now is using a loophole where they use the USA as the middleman of these arms exports to still end up in the Zionist entity. So these are parts that are still ending up at Israeli ports. And actually today, the Arms Embargo Now Coalition, which PYM is a part of, we released a second report that highlighted even more shipments. First, we outlined bullets and cartridges, mortar shells that were going to the entity. Today's report shows that it's explosives, TNT, and more F-35 parts that are making their way to Israeli ports. And I encourage everyone to read more about this at armsembargonow.ca. So this is where we want to focus our efforts. We want to organize the Arab youth. We want to organize the Arab communities to realize what's happening in our backyards. Because we're part of this society, we have the ability to be the agents of change and halt these gears of imperial war economy. So I think this is the biggest intervention. And there's a whole historical context of how we are divided as a people post the Oslo Accords. This is what the PYM serves to mend as well. And I think it's through actions like this that we're going to get closer to our goal of uniting our people for a national liberation struggle.
Absolutely. And I really appreciate your emphasis on this reorientation and how it requires attentiveness to time and scale. And so it's about seeing the long arc of struggle, even in the immediacy and the urgency of action in the face of genocide, for example. And so whether that's sustaining mutual aid networks, as both you and Nisreen were able to speak to, or creating political education spaces, which you and the PYM does in a way that is so beautiful, but also so, I hate the word productive, that you do so well. And so, yeah, just insisting that the work of liberation in and of itself is, like Beverly was saying, relational, collective, and iterative, and that every act of refusal, every decision to learn from the people most affected then becomes part of this new orientation. And it's a way of mapping and creating possibility and responsibility. And so again, Omar, every time you speak, I learn something new. And again, so grateful to be in community with you as well. So thank you for sharing.
Appreciate you guys.
I have a question. And the question is, I mean, thank you so much for your very concise and complete presentation. But we are witnessing and we're faced with a really complex context where, people are made to believe there is a ceasefire, which we know is a chimera. That is not a reality. That's one. Secondly, we're also being told that there is some kind of negotiations that's happening, which of course is not true. You can't have negotiations without the Palestinian people present. Like that was what happened before in 1948, which is why we're here which is why things are where it is, because the Palestinian people were not part of the negotiation about creating an Israel, right? A state. So the question then becomes, what in terms of all that we're doing here and all that's being done by people on the ground, what will get us to the place where Palestinian people can reclaim Palestine? And is that at all a possibility? And is there any sense or a way to imagine, or are people imagining what that would look like for Palestinian people in a context of safety, in a context of collectivity, in a context of governing themselves and not being governed by the state of Israel? What would that look like, and what it is that we should be doing in addition to what we are already doing, because there's a lot of work that Palestinians are doing and have been doing over decades, what it is that we should be doing right now as part of the refusal that will get us to creating that world that Palestinians want to achieve. Yeah.
Yeah, that's
I know it's a lot.
No, that's the critical question of our liberation.
Yes.
Right? I think history points us to two scenarios in the Palestinian context. One where we have put trust in international institutions like the UN, like the ICJ, or any international body or negotiations. And then the second one is where we've taken up struggle, organized people power, grassroots organizing, specifically in Palestine in like the 1930s, organizing the farmers and our peasant class. And then in Lebanon, in the refugee camps, organizing our people in the refugee camps. These two scenarios have brought us to completely different trajectories. The international institutions have brought us in the, like you said, 1948, a loss of our land, the illegal occupation of our land, and the forced dispossession of our people. In 1982, negotiations with the US that are kind of copy-pasted today with the Palestinian factions of today. The PLO negotiating with the US and Israel led to the Sabra and Shatila massacres. And today we're seeing history repeat itself. I think what's different today is that we have the examples of history. We have an accumulation of knowledge, of organizational knowledge, of how it is that we organize people power. The first Intifada and the second Intifada were incredible examples of this. How do we build systems of sustenance for Palestinians? Whether it's armed struggle, whether it's economic alternatives for people to take on labor strikes, these have been the most successful strategies for the Palestinian people. And I think for us in the diaspora, our struggle is understanding how the system works, and where we can be the thorns on the sides of imperialism. For us, that's the arms trade, that's the export of weapon components. It's also the ideological front. It's the very premise that we refuse to be pacified by statehood, that we refuse to be pacified by symbolic measures alone. I think in the past, we have fallen victim to this, not out of a lack of anything, but more so just the conditions we've been put in.
Mm-hmm.
But what you have today is a global capitalist imperialist system that is sharpening the contradictions for everyone. And you cannot reject that this system is not it, right? Whether it's someone who is Canadian or is born here, grows up in the West, they are starting to see how Palestine, how Sudan, how Congo, how Venezuela, how the global struggle is related to their inability to purchase eggs, to purchase groceries, right? So it's multi-pronged for us. And I think to answer your question clearly, it's building people power. It's specifically for us as the Palestinian youth movement, is bringing our fragmented people together under one political umbrella. We're united on national liberation. We can have different currents. Like, we as Palestinians are not a monolith. We are a mosaic of ideas and beliefs. But what we are all united on is our right to our land, our right to live on our land, to return to our land. And around this key point, we can organize people power, because governments can ignore our demand for an arms embargo, and they can ignore, like, when we were pushing for a ceasefire. But what they can't ignore is if we're able to successfully organize divestments that bring material impact and impact the capital. If it starts to impact which candidates are being elected, if it's starting to affect their ability to operate business as usual. So for us, if we can get to a point where we as Arabs, and therefore our allies and everyone involved, is organized towards this shared objective, this is going to bring material change from the diaspora, and our people on the ground are more than capable and have the accumulation and have the power and sumud, steadfastness, to confront the physical side of this occupation. So all of this working in tandem. Historically, we have never had the diaspora, I think, at this level of consciousness. Obviously, there's setbacks always, but so long as there's organization, so long as we are committed to and convicted in this, I think we're headed in a positive trajectory.
So the hoisting of the flag should then be that moment of building and a larger mobilizing movement. It should be used as an opportunity. It should not stay at the level of the symbolic. It should be used as an opportunity to mobilize people on the ground in connection to the kind of struggles that we are seeing on the ground in Palestine for Palestinian freedom and liberation, is what I'm hearing you say.
Absolutely, because that flag wasn't put up on the accord of the city of Toronto or Olivia
it
Chow. It was put up because of our work, because of what we've done. And yes, it's symbolic. We don't want the city to take this, but we know that's our flag, and we dictate what it means. So, absolutely.
That's beautiful.
Thank you very much, Omar.
Thank you, Omar.
Thank you, Dr.
Pleasure. Pleasure. Have you.
My pleasure. Have a great day, guys.
Amazing. You too. And with that, I see that Ryan is now in the room. Ryan is another organizer whom I have so much respect for. They are a student organizer at TMU, Toronto Metropolitan University, and they're organized specifically with SJPTMU. Thank you so much for joining.
Welcome.
Of course. Thank you so much for inviting me. I really appreciate you giving us the platform just to talk as things have been escalating.
Yes.
I do want to talk a little bit about what happened in the past 2 weeks. So, as you all might know, on November 5th, students advocating for Palestine were brutally assaulted by an individual invited by the TMU registered student group, Students Supporting Israel. So Jonathan Carton, one of the platformed IOF war criminals, was seen, as posted by various sources online, violently throwing out and injuring protesters, and student advocates faced additional brutalization and criminalization at the hands of Toronto Police Services for simply protesting the platforming of war criminals and the promotion of genocide by a registered student group. And as a result of this brutalization, students had various injuries, including but not limited to concussions and bruised ribs, among like many other testimonies. So following this brutalization and criminalization of student advocates, both the president and union released statements regurgitating the same sentiments of condemning any acts of violence and their commitment to safety and inclusion. Additionally, administration is currently undertaking review of, I don't know if you are aware of what happened on September 19th, where a student was physically assaulted by TMU security. So they're taking on a third-party investigation regarding that, as well as what happened on November 5th. While TMSU, on the other hand, our union, is exploring the option of engaging a third-party investigation, stating that this investigation will review whether a TMSU recognized student group breached TMSU policy. And it's important to note that the recruiting for foreign armed forces is a crime under Canadian law and a violation of TMSU policy, actually, which would have been addressed had the union actually prioritized advocating for its students. So this response once again displays their blatant anti-Palestinian racism and lack of commitment or regard for the safety of students. And the safety of students, faculty, and community members are once again being compromised, as on November 20th, SSI TMU planned to host another former IOF war criminal. So this actually marks the third time IOF have been invited by the student group, as seen on April 3rd and November 5th, 2025. So Shea DeLuca, born and raised in Toronto, joined the IOF in 1995 after finishing high school, where he served as a combat engineer building explosives. This individual has stated on the record, "If I had to do it again, I would," calling this period of his life engaged in the violent occupation and brutalization of Palestinian people on the ground life-changing. And he regularly speaks on university campuses, pushing the narrative that normalizes the occupation and denies the ethnic cleansing and genocide of Palestinian people. His talk often focuses on gay rights as a pinkwashing tactic, which the November 20th event is also making sure to highlight. They make no mention of his previous time serving in the IOF, despite him on many platforms glorifying that aspect of his life. And so over the last 2 years, students advocating for Palestine at TMU have been met with silence, suppression, and brutalization by this institution, in particular by the president, Mohamed Lashemi. Students have attempted to engage in dialogue regarding this institution's complicity in genocide and occupation, as well as their fostering of an unsafe environment for Palestinian community members and their allies. We have been shut down every single time. It is clear that administration and TMSU have no qualms in continuing to ignore student voices and calls to action. So, Students for Justice in Palestine at TMU have actually just released a statement and email campaign this morning regarding the November 20th event, as well as what has been happening what has happened on the 5th and on April 3rd, like just mentioning all of the times that we have seen IOF platformed on our campuses. We are requesting that the President Mohamed Lashemi, members of administration, and TMSU respond to student demands, which state that they must publicly affirm that students have the right to engage in advocacy and protest, and guarantee that no student will face academic, disciplinary, or administrative sanctions for exercising those rights, including in relation to the protest that took place on November 5th. We demand that they implement clear policies to prohibit the participation or presence of foreign military personnel and representatives being hosted by university-sponsored clubs, university-related events, or in university spaces. We demand that they release a public statement condemning the presence of foreign military personnel engaged in genocide at a registered student group event, including the event that took place on November 5th, and denouncing the violence perpetrated against students by the Israeli soldier attendees and the Toronto Police Services. We also demand that they implement clear policies to recognize anti-Palestinian racism as a distinct form of racism as defined by the Arab Canadian Lawyers Association, and ensure it is not conflated with Islamophobia or anti-Arab racism. Integrate this recognition into the university's harassment and discrimination policies. So I would like to just end what I've just thrown at all of you by stating that these things being witnessed at TMU have not been isolated or random incidents, as much as it seems like a shock. They are a direct result of the complicity and silence of TMU administration and our union, TMSU. SSI, Students Supporting Israel, felt empowered because like they felt empowered to host war criminals while being a registered student group because these so-called leaders at this institution have not taken the necessary steps to address the issue or preventative measures to ensure it did not happen again. TMU and TMSU have cultivated an unsafe space for Palestinian students and their allies, as well as Palestinian community members, where we face criminalization and brutalization for objecting to the platforming of those that have murdered our friends and families. They have enabled the platforming of war criminals who openly and proudly boast about the war crimes committed on the ground, risking the safety and well-being of their students through this refusal to speak out against the actions of this student group, instead condemning violence and releasing vague statements, which is ridiculous because, again, we're seeing this happen on November 20th. So we're unfortunately having to depend on our community to pressure TMU leadership, including administration and TMSU, in ensuring they take accountability for this, as they have shown us that is something they are unwilling to take on despite their so-called institutional values. A major ask that I have before leaving the space is that you please visit our Instagram and go to our link tree and sign that email campaign holding this institution accountable, because unfortunately they won't do that on their own. They need the pressure and they need the eyes. So now's the time to do that, because this will continue. They will continue platforming IOF war criminals. They will continue risking safety of the students and completely disregarding Palestinian community members and having their literal murders on campus, which is absolutely ridiculous. But I thank you so much for providing me this platform to share all of this.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. I guess I would like, did you, are you, when you organize, do you reach out to the community to make sure that you have support from the community? Do you have a group of marshals to protect you? It is my position that the university won't protect you. We know where the university's position is, and we know how free speech is used, and it's used against, as this morning, one of the speakers, one of the panelists on the teaching, reminded us that in fact, it is always used against us, those of us who are challenging from liberated spaces. Free speech is always used against us. And the institution and the state uses it against us all the time, and particularly in these moments that we're witnessing, where there is that rise of the ultra-right and the rise of fascism, Islamophobia, racism. We're seeing how free speech is construed as hate speech when it comes from the position of those who are fighting for liberation and freedom. So I guess one of the things I'm asking is, how are you ensuring that you connect with community support so that you too are protected as you oppose, what is, a challenge to, or what is, an attack on, Palestinian struggle and Palestinian organizing.
100%. I would say this, in general, we have always leaned on community because institutions have never been something to lean on. TMU especially has a great way of just presenting themselves a certain way to the public. Well, students know exactly what their values are, and that is definitely not in protecting students or advocating for students, or like what is anything good in this world, to be honest. But one thing is, I think it's important to show up for community, to bring that community towards your spaces as well. And that's something students in our group really try to do. Um, we try to be in solidarity with communities, not just so that they do that for us, but I think it's important for continuous liberation in every space. And so I think this was especially a learning lesson because not a learning lesson, but it was a moment where we really felt in community with everybody and felt the support. Because those that majority of all our supports, if not all, came from the community. The university just released really stupid, vague statements, saying they connected with students when in reality they didn't. They were releasing statements talking about the event as if people weren't hurt, as if people weren't injured, as if people weren't trying to advocate against genocide or IOF on our campus. So I would just say it's continuous work to be in community, but it's the only thing to depend on, as these institutions are really profit driven, and especially TMU, they'll do whatever makes them money. And so um, it's just never anything good. And it's not something my answer is a bit all over the place, but it's just institutions have never been something to depend on. So it feels like community has just been something consistent, and it's just we have to show up for each other and be in solidarity all the time. And we all really appreciated the community that showed up for us on November 5th and even now.
Absolutely. Yeah, and students. Yeah, and I just wanted to add as well, like as a student at U of T, we see that students are faced with this real material violence when they resist, institutional and state complicity and oppression. And I just wanted to name as well really quickly that maintaining solidarity and systems of care in the face of this intimidation is an example of that generative refusal, like you named. And it shows that protest isn't just about opposing injustice. It's about creating these spaces of accountability and collective political possibility, even when these institutions like TMU, like U of T, try to suppress us and try to suppress our movements. And so I just want to say that your actions mattered. They were seen, and that the courage and that the care that you showed up with and that your comrades showed up with really demonstrated that we're part of a larger struggle for justice. And so we will continue showing up as U of T students, and I'm sure community will as well, because what you're doing makes a difference. What you're doing threatens the legitimacy of TMU, and and that just speaks to your organizing on your campus. And so thank you so much for joining. We will make sure to direct folks to the link tree in your Instagram bio to sign on to that email campaign. And I hope to continue being in community and in solidarity and in spaces of protest with you going forward as well. So thank you for joining.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I appreciate it. Have a wonderful day.
Absolutely. Bye.
Bye.
And with that, I see that Omar has now joined from the Canadian Federation of Students, Ontario. Omar is the national executive representative of this group. The mandate of the CFSO is to fight for free and accessible education, as education is a human right for all people and should be treated as such. And I will say that Omar and I go way back, and I've actually missed you a lot. So it's great to see you and to see your face on camera. Thank you so much for joining, and I can't wait to hear what you have to share.
Welcome, Omar. I think we met. Did we meet, Omar? Yes, we met okay, great. That's all. I thought you looked familiar. Yeah.
I love
I
to
think
see
we met. Welcome.
No. Yeah, no, I missed you too, Saad. It's been so long. And obviously, Dr. Bain, we've met at UTM. We were talking about Bill 33, and I'm going to be talking sort of about sort of in the same vein. Instead, I'm going to be talking about Bill C2, or what was recently reproposed as Bill C12,
Oh, that would be
and
great.
how and what the impacts are on students.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Like what the impacts are on
the work that
students
you all are
as
doing to
marginalized communities as a whole.
refuse that. Yeah, great. Wonderful.
Yeah, yeah, of course, right? So something to note before I start is that education is a human right. Despite that, education continues to be treated as a business, both provincially and federally. It's clear that the government is attempting to privatize education for the sake of profit and is foregoing the actual quality of education. Due to this, education has been chronically and intentionally underfunded for decades. Instead of acknowledging their mistake and holistically investing in education, the government is instead xenofying our campus. Students are being incredibly treated alongside the face.
Omar, there's some
economic
technical difficulty. Maybe it's the Wi-Fi.
Sorry.
I'm so sorry to interrupt.
Is it Omar? It's not your
Mhm.
Wi-Fi, it's not mine. So it might be
No worries.
Omar, I think there's some trouble with your Wi-Fi.
It might be my
Yeah,
Maybe you could try switching your video off. Sometimes that helps. Let's see if that makes a difference.
Sorry. Okay. I think this might be a little better. Was I
Yeah,
just
this is
cutting out?
great. Yes, you were, but
Perfect.
this is
Yeah.
perfect. Thank you.
No,
okay.
my bad. Here, I'll just restart that. I'll just
Okay,
restart.
Thank you.
you figured it
No
out.
worries,
Okay,
no worries.
great.
No, we've been having so many like technical difficulties on our side as
Yeah,
well.
yeah. Okay.
Um, yeah, so hi everyone. So my name
Uh,
is Ahmad from CFS Ontario, as you just heard. So I'm going to be talking about the impacts of Bill C2, which was recently reproposed as Bill C12, and the impacts of them on students and marginalized communities as a whole. So what I was saying earlier is that education is a human right, and despite that fact, education continues to be treated as a business, both on the provincial and the federal level. And it's clear that the government is attempting to continuously privatize and corporatize our education for the sake of making a profit while foregoing the actual quality of education. And it's due to this, we have been seeing the chronic and intentional underfunding of education for decades. Instead of acknowledging their mistake and holistically actually investing in education, the government is instead banking on the rampant xenophobia plaguing our campuses. International students are already being mistreated in our education system. Alongside the xenophobia they face, they are constantly being scapegoated. And in many cases, international students are also migrants who are facing deep economic exploitation. What we know is that on average in Ontario alone, international students make up a third of academic institutions' operating budgets. This over-reliance on international students comes from the root issue that I just mentioned, the chronic and intentional underfunding of our education. What Bill C2/C12, whatever you want to call it, does is amplify the dangerous rhetoric and reinforce these ideas rather than acknowledging the real issues at hand. People are facing food insecurity, housing precarity, struggling to find jobs. And instead of funding public services and finding real, tangible solutions to these problems, the government is content with putting the blame on immigrants. So, when we're talking about Bill C2, what does this actually entail for students? This bill furthers the over surveillance not only on our campuses, which we have already been seeing a rise of following the COVID-19 lockdown, but also against marginalized communities as a whole. A clear attempt to target communities that are not only already over surveilled and struggling due to the failures of this government. This bill is being proposed as a way to protect so-called Canada's borders. But we know that's just a yet another fear-mongering tactic to push the blame of the government's failures onto immigrants, while also reinforcing colonial and imperial rhetoric to justify the state's dedicated investment in global injustice, war, and genocide. It follows the same pattern of every single nasty legislation that we have been seeing, where it's incredibly sweeping and is trying to give the government more control in places they have no business sticking their noses in. We were just saying, Dr. Bain, when we met, we were talking about Bill 33. We're seeing the same exact thing here in Ontario. Bill 33 is the government attempting to give themselves unilateral control over education across all levels in ways that historically they've never had before.
Mhm.
All of that being said, we're seeing an alarming rise of unnecessary government oversight across all levels of government, targeting already our most marginalized communities. Students have been fighting against these acts of oppressions for years and will continue to fight and refuse their systems and proposals until we actually achieve a true solution, which is rooted in our collective liberation. Thank you.
Wow, wonderful.
Absolutely. Yeah, Umar is just brilliant. And I love your emphasis again on this possibility of organizing something better, something freer. And as student organizers, again, you folks at the CFSO support student movements across the country, which is so brilliant. But as student organizers, we practice it every day in our actions, in our commitments, and in the futures that we hope to somehow make real through engaging in generative refusals and the ethic of not knowing. And, in our rejection of the pressure to have complete certainty or perfect expertise when entering organizing spaces. And so, yeah, you've left me with a lot to think about. And I just wanted to thank you for everything that you shared, especially your connection to these different bills. Um, and
And
yeah.
and Omar, can I ask you about you said Bill C2 has been repurposed as Bill 711 C11, sorry, BC11. Is that correct?
Like read 12. So
Oh,
uh,
sorry. As C12 or B12?
C12, C12.
Okay, and what does that now look like?
Um,
What's the difference? And
So
what,
Bill C2 had a lot of backlash when it was initially proposed. And so what does the government do? They try to gaslight, very simply. They just
the US
reproposed it.
community? Yeah,
Exactly. They
I'm
just
sorry.
reproposed it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
they just reproposed it. It's basically the same exact thing, but it's just a little more focused on the idea of um, we have to get people who entered so-called Canada illegally out of here. And it's inherently, once again, it plays to their colonial rhetoric that they have continuously been proposed, that they have continuously been pushing this anti-xenophobia, like
Right.
anti-xenophobic rise that we've been seeing all across so-called Canada. And the government, through these bills, are just playing into it and they're just banking in on it. And they're just hoping people will actually ignore their mistakes and instead focus on the wrong things.
Right, right. Because I mean, this bill, as it started, which is the border bill, was supposed. I mean, it's really set up so that it will keep people out, and the people who are already in will have like a year, I think it is, to actually to have their claim actually be dealt with. And we know how long claims take. We know how much backlog there is. So people are going to end up being deported without even having a hearing.
Mhm.
I wonder how much, in terms of the bill as it is now, C12, how much of that um, has shifted, or would it still be the same? I think they might have, they lengthened the amount of time that people would get before they actually are expected to leave the country without having a hearing, I think is what it is. But the question remains, though, is that it's never going to work that way.
Mhm.
Not intended to work that way.
Mhm.
Because if it was, we wouldn't need such a bill in the first place.
Exactly.
And that bill is very much a bill that actually was created in conjunction with the US own border bill, right?
Mhm.
So that so if people are coming from the US, that it means those people are going to be sent back to the US, is
Mhm.
my understanding. And they're going to be, prosecuted, right? They're gonna, you know what I mean? So we're seeing that there's much more of a criminalization of migrants and immigrants at the border, which is what's going to happen. That this seems to be what the Canadian government is intended to do, is to criminalize migrants even more than they're already criminalized at the borders.
And we're seeing this, especially through the use of language, whether it is illegal or alien, or even like the demonization of the word migrant, right?
Right.
Language is an incredibly powerful tool, and we know depending on how they use it, we can tell what their agenda is. Through this bill, it's incredibly clear.
Yes. Are you working, is the CFSO working with community in terms of resisting this kind of move? What kind of work has been happening around this in terms of the refusal? And you said,
Mhm.
one piece was in terms of the shift, the changing, right? That there
Mhm.
has been, because of the uproar, there has been some switch, but we still know that that's not sufficient, because we recently see that in Vancouver, and there were big protests recently against the bill, if I'm
Mhm.
not mistaken, right?
Mhm.
Uh,
Yeah.
so what sort of work the CFSO have been doing in conjunction with some of that kind of work on the ground, with people on the ground? I'm
Yeah.
curious.
Yeah, of course. So we've been talking to a lot of different solidarity group, a lot of our different solidarity partners. I think the rally that you were talking about that happened in Vancouver, you said,
Yes,
that was part of the Draw the Line rally, which was happening all across all across the country, and it happened here as well. We showed up, we
right,
amplified, we support in any way that we can, depending on what the asks actually are.
right.
And so it's at the end of the day, like I mentioned this affects our students, this affects our marginalized communities. It is a terrifying bill that is being proposed, and it needs to be felt.
Absolutely. And if I may too, like coming back to generative refusals, I think that it has to do with reorienting our practices of knowledge and community. And Omar, I love your emphasis on how language shapes reality and language as a powerful tool, because in fact, through our organizing and through the work that you folks are doing, You refuse the assumption that these universities and that these institutions hold a monopoly on truth, on expertise, on legitimate knowledge. And in then our organizing spaces, whether it's the statement that you folks put out or our teach-ins or late night meetings at King's College Circle, we then co-create knowledge and we reject that monopoly on truth and language as well that is pushed out to to break our community. And so, yeah, I really, really appreciate your emphasis on that.
Of course, no worries. Thank you so much for having me, y'all.
Thank you, Omar.
Thank you, Omar. Bye. That was incredible.
Yes. So, Sarah,
Yes.
I'd like to hear from you in
I
terms
was
of the work you have been doing, around refusals, particularly. I mean, you were, Sarah Rasick, for people who don't know who Sarah is, has been very active, in the work around the people's encampment that happened. Is it already 2 years or a year and a half?
almost a year and a half.
Almost, yeah.
Yeah.
It seems like it,
Yeah.
the encampment, and you were one of the spokespeople or spokespersons for the work and for the protests that happened, and in terms of BDS and pushing the university, to divest from Israeli institutions and Israeli scholastic institutions.
Right.
Yeah, I'd like to hear from you, for you to tell us and tell our listeners the kind of refusal work that you did, but also the work that you're still doing.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you're one of the faculty who supported us and kept us safe in that space. And so we deeply appreciate you and the ways that you continue to show up for us. I will keep it short, just looking at the time, it is now 2:40, but definitely happy to share on this. And so, yes, I organize with students at the University of Toronto, students who are committed to building a different kind of political and ethical horizon, students who want their politics to be rooted in genuine solidarity and in liberation and in collective care. And so, again, grounding this conversation in the topic of generative refusals. At the University of Toronto, we see the administration framing student organizing as disruption, as something unreasonable. But in our organizing, refusal is just a beginning. It is not simply saying no, but in fact, it has to do with choosing to withdraw our consent from systems of violence while actively then creating the conditions for something else to grow. Refusal becomes generative when it opens up new relational and ethical and political possibilities. And for us as student organizers at this university, this has definitely taken, I would say, a variety of different forms. First, generative refusal is expressed through a refusal to normalize the university's complicity in genocide, in exploitation, in dispossession. And so, you mentioned the encampments. When we set up the encampments, when we disrupt board meetings, when we challenge the institution's investments and partnerships through reports that we then put out, we are creating a space where the university's actions must be accountable to the people who make its existence possible. And so that includes students and workers, faculty like yourself, staff, communities. A refusal then produces visibility and conversation and pressure, but it also produces and generates rather new alignments and new cross-movement solidarities. Second, I would say, coming back to, I think, what Omar was mentioning, generative refusal is about orienting, or rather reorienting, our practices of knowledge and community. And so refusing the assumption that the university, like I mentioned earlier, holds a monopoly on truth or on legitimate knowledge. And so drawing on lived experiences then, drawing on intergenerational struggle, drawing on feminist ethics, on Indigenous thought, on Palestinian resistance. And in doing so, we create intellectual spaces that the university does not and perhaps cannot provide. And so our refusal then of dominant epistemologies rather becomes a commitment to cultivate new ones. Next, I would say that generative refusals within the context of organizing at U of T has to do with how we understand power. And so in a university that disciplines students through fear, through isolation, through bureaucratic processes, we refuse the narrative that we are powerless. In the encampment, students who came in radicalized for Palestine left with a much deeper understanding of revolutionary politics, of how movements grow, of how solidarity is built, of how collective power can shift material conditions. And so our refusal then generated courage and political clarity and confidence. And that in and of itself is something significant and worthy to mention. Generative refusal is then also relational, and maybe I'll end it with that. We refuse to abandon one another in moments of, state and institutional repression, as we're seeing today, as we've been seeing for the past 2+ years now, when students face, disciplinary hearings, arrests, targeted harassment. We build networks of care. We take those moments and we build. We show up to jail support. We call lawyers. We feed each other. We protect one another. And this refusal then of disposability is generative because it builds the infrastructure for long-term struggle beyond, individual actions, beyond individual protests like the encampment. It builds for the future. And so really grounding ourselves in this ethic of not knowing, rejecting the pressure to have complete certainty, refusing the neoliberal university's demand for mastery. It opens up space, I think, for humility and for curiosity and for collective learning. And it teaches us to move slowly, and it teaches us to ask better questions and to allow for the unknown to shape us as well in that process. And so, from that come many things, and I can go on and on, so I'll stop there. But that's a little bit about organizing at the University of Toronto as it relates to this practice, this political project of generative refusals.
Thank you so much, Sarah.
Absolutely. Thank you for all of the work that you do, for continually supporting myself and other students, and for being one of the cool faculty members we have here. We are so grateful to have you, and we hope that you're able to stick around for as long as possible at the university as a faculty member. I don't know. Yeah, I don't want to put anything out there, but
You're very
please don't
kind.
leave us.
Thank you very much. You are amazing. And I
So
want to thank our followers. Thank you so much for following with us this session and the one before. And stay tuned for the next session, which is on which focuses on the flotilla and refusals. So see you shortly. Okay, bye-bye.
everyone, bye.